Today's podcast is presented by Podgo. Podgo is the easiest way for you to monetize your podcast, providing podcasters with a flat rate for ad space so you always know how much you will get when you include an ad from Podgo. Apply today and become a member and immediately be connected with advertisers that fit your audience. That's podgo.co at podgo.co. And be sure to add Casting Through Ancient Greece in How Did You Hear About Podgo section of the application. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck, and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece. Today's episode is going to be somewhat different to the narrative we've been following. But don't worry, we'll get right back on track next fortnight. I recently teamed up with Steve from Spartan History Podcast, and we recorded a collaboration episode. I had a great time talking with Steve, and we chatted for around 2.5 hours. We talked about ourselves, our shows, while also talking about various topics around Greek history. The episode was unscripted, as you'll be able to tell, something I'm not entirely accustomed to yet. My thoughts when off script seemed to bounce around the place, but I had a great time, and hope to do this more often with Steve. The episode has been broken up into 2 parts. What you're about to hear is part 1, which runs for around an hour and 18 minutes. Part 2 of the conversation will be on Steve's podcast, found on all good podcast platforms. Alternatively, you can visit www.spartanhistorypodcast.com, but I've also provided links in the show notes. Also, you can follow Steve over at Twitter at Spartan_history or over at Facebook at Spartan History Podcast. Also, for my Patreon members, I have uploaded the entire conversation on the RSS feed, along with the video version of our talk, if you prefer to watch. If you would like to support the series, head over to patreon.com/Casting Through Ancient Greece for access to these bonuses, plus much, much more. So I hope you enjoy the conversation, and remember, when you're finished with part 1, head on over to Spartan History Podcast for part 2.
Okay, folks, well, we have something a little bit different today. I'm joined by Mark from Casting Through Ancient Greece, a fellow compatriot from Australia and podcaster, and we're going to work through just a general overview of where our shows are going, where they've been, and I guess to get to know each other a little bit better for the benefit of our collective and differing audiences. G'day, Mark. It's a great pleasure to meet you.
G'day, Steve. It's finally good to be catching up in, I guess, sort of in person.
Well, considering the climate and social distancing, it's about as good as we're going to expect. And I guess for the listeners' sake, we probably live, even though we live in the same country, we live roughly, I'm saying, 3,000 kilometres apart from each other. You're in Alice Springs, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right on the East Coast, and I'm right in the middle of Australia.
The dead centre. Never been there. Yeah, what took you to Alice Springs?
Well, I'm actually from Alice Springs. I was born here, moved away, and then came back. So
is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the population of Alice Springs?
About 25 to 30,000.
Yeah,
so
right. Okay.
Decent size. It's not too small, but still pretty good. No, don't have to worry about traffic too much. Don't have to pay for parking.
And I hear you have the lovely ginormous rock nearby as well.
Sorry?
Is it Uluru? Is that
Uluru?
nearby?
Oh, yeah. That's still probably another 4 hours drive down the road. But, yeah.
Good old Australia is a big place. So I guess it'd be interesting just to, I guess, for my listeners who we don't share, just to hear a little bit about your podcast and I guess, more about what influences got you into podcasting, what got you into history, and just a little bit about yourself would be great to hear.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess I'll start off with what got me into history. I did history at school, but while I was at school, I was never really interested too much in the subject itself. It was mainly after I finished school that I took up more of a fascination into it. I think it was more I haven't got someone sort of guiding me in a direction. I could pick and choose what I wanted to look at and study. But basically I left school in around 2000, and since then I've just been reading history non-stop and travelled through many different time periods. And I had a friend who was right into ancient history, and he did recommend to me that you need to start reading about ancient Greece. And I was sort of at that stage more into modernish sort of era history, and I thought, oh, it sounds a bit boring, but sort of kept it in the back of my head. And then one day I ended up seeing, I think it was just a Penguin Classics version of Herodotus sitting on the shelf in a bookstore. I thought,
Nice.
I'll give it a go. So I bought that. I think it was like $12, so pretty good value. And basically, once I read that one, I was hooked. I thought it was almost like a whole new way of telling history, very unlike anything you find in any modern historical work. And
it's amazing that you got through Herodotus. It'll either make you a fan forever or banish you from history's pages for all eternity.
Yeah, I think that's what I enjoyed about it. There was so much that's just left to interpretation. It's not a history in the sense that we would call a history today. But again, this was like the very beginnings of what history would become. So I really like the mix of traditional tales, but then you've got the underlying of an actual historical work there as well. So I found that very fascinating. Anyway, that got me hooked on wanting to know more. So I basically continued reading, and I never know, over the years I ended up with a couple of bookshelves full of books just on Greek history. But I must admit, once I sort of read a lot through, I think I focused mainly on sort of where Herodotus picks things up, and then I went all the way through to the death of Alexander. And then I was like, all right, time to move on to a new period. And so I started reading other stuff. But for some reason, I just had it in the back of my head. There was always this thing about, I want to know a bit more about Greek history. So I basically went back and I thought there's got to be, I need to do more with this. And initially I basically took up studies in ancient history, and I also did international history, which I think was more modern history. But I found the world of academia in history very unsatisfying. And it really was sucking my enthusiasm for the whole topic out. So, and then on top of that, young family, I know here in Australia at that time, I think all the courses in uni were almost doubling in price by that stage. And so I just deferred it for some time. But again, I was like, what else can I do with this? And obviously after listening to, Mike Duncan's Rome many years ago and other historical podcasts, I thought it'd be nice to do something like that. So I began just writing scripts, just rough scripts, probably for 12 months, just seeing what I could write. And in the end decided to just go for it and started the series up.
It's amazing. It's interesting in that we had no collaboration whatsoever, but our podcast basically went online at roughly the same time. I think I started in November 2019 and you were a month after that.
Yeah, it was towards the end of January 2020 that I started up.
Yeah.
And I think it was very soon after that I basically stumbled across yourself and we started exchanging messages. So it was good to sort of,
fantastic to have the support.
Yeah, develop sort of parallel to each other, which was good.
Do you think that, and I've often wondered about this, that, the focus on ancient history in Australia is very low. Like when you talk about history in Australia, it's generally the history of the world wars and possibly the Boer War as well. But, do you think that's a symptom of the fact that the country itself's only just over 200 years old? And if we were to extend our history as Australians any further than that, you go back to the convicts and then back into English history. And for lack of a better description, we don't tend to align too closely with the English. Do you think that's possibly why there's not that focus in Australia?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is the fact that our sort of history is not very old, so to speak. I mean, so where do we draw upon to look back even further to our origins? I mean, and this can become a contentious issue too when you're trying to look, what developed the West, and then also looking at what was happening in Australia, especially within Australia. Looking at this, it can become a bit touchy. But I definitely noticed. When I was at school, it was a lot around World War II, World War One. Especially, I did a lot around the Russian Revolution, which was interesting. But it didn't seem to go too far back. I remember doing a lot of ancient Egypt back in primary school as well. But I think that was down to our teacher, who had a real fascination around that area. But
it's a funny one. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, even at the moment, obviously we're approaching Anzac Day. I think that's in a couple of days' time, and my daughter's at school. That's this week. It's all been Anzac Day, World War One stuff at school at the moment. So, and they're only in year 3, year 1. So, it's good to see that they're still teaching that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and you yourself served in the military, I understand. Is that right?
Yeah, back in the early 2000s. Yeah.
So Anzac Day has a particular significance above and beyond what it would for ordinary Australians for yourself?
Yeah, and we've had a lot of family members that have served as well in World War II and World War One. So it's good, and I'm trying to always just impart that on the kids too. So every year since they've been born, they've had something to do with Anzac Day, which has been good.
Yeah, it's a pilgrimage for a lot of Australians and New Zealanders. But there, I had the pleasure of working in Turkey for several years and led a number of tours down to Anzac Day during the Gallipoli celebrations of the campaign there, and really brought it home to me. Not having a strong military background in my family, it was a public holiday. It was something that came up every year. But once you see the veneration that our countrymen and our fellow countrymen from across the ditch there, the New Zealanders have for that place, it really rammed it home. And there's definitely one of those things that I think that most Aussies and Kiwis should get onto on their bucket list anyway. It's a very important thing. It's one of the most significantly historical events that took place in our country's history.
Yeah, definitely think it would have been great sitting there watching the sun rise over the cove there, but that would have been an amazing experience.
It's cold, very cold, and and you hadn't had a shower for a few days. But look, I think like I used to say to a lot of my guests, that if you can't sort of put up with a couple of days of privation and no showers, no toilets, then you're not properly honouring the sacrifice that was laid down by those people there. And what was even more interesting was that if the Turks, for example, had sailed to Australia and fought a war against us, I doubt we would welcome their celebration of such an event. But they were so hospitable towards Australians and Kiwis when we were over there. In fact, a number of Turks said that we didn't know any better. We didn't know who the Turkish people were, and I would imagine Australians in 1915 didn't know who the Turkish people were. We were going for king and country, so to speak, and they considered it just a handshake, albeit a bloody one, between our two countries. So it's something that they take very seriously as well. And of course, the general of the Turks that masterminded the victory of the Ottomans in that war, Ataturk, went on to eventually become the country's first president. So it's a very important day for the Turkish people too.
It's amazing how the passage of time can, I guess, alleviate a lot of those tensions. And it's interesting too. Especially with World War One and World War Two. It's when you're looking between the soldiers, it's not so much an ideological difference. It's basically we were there to do a job, they were there to do a job. It's over now, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of ideological hangover to catch everyone up on.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think while there were some overarching ideologies on, I guess perhaps on the behalf of the opposition on the ground level between man to man in combat, there really wasn't a lot of difference between the people there. They were just doing a job exactly as you say.
Yeah,
tough times. May they never come again.
Yes, but things have changed a bit. So with this world of smaller wars, but anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting time to be at the moment. Well, yeah. So that's what brought you into history and into podcasting. Like, were there any other podcasts apart from Mike Duncan that really stick out in mind that got you interested in podcasting?
I remember listening to I mentioned ancient Greece is something that kept calling me back, and another time period is the Napoleonic period. I'm quite obsessed with. But there was another podcast I listened to. I'm trying to remember the name of it now. It's came out quite some years ago, and it had an Australian guy that co-hosted it with an American historian. I think it was like Napoleon 101, something like that. And they travelled through the entire Napoleonic sort of period. Wow. I enjoyed listening to that one. Though I did find how would I put this? Napoleon could do no wrong in their show, which I found very interesting. But it was still a very entertaining show to listen to.
A little bit biased there. I mean, for me, definitely it was. I mean, Mike Duncan's History of Rome. There was a massive influence on me getting to podcasting, and I really didn't research the genesis of the show, and I think I fell into the impression that as I was listening to it, it was quite current. And then there was an episode where they were mentioning a tour of Rome that they were going on, and I immediately looked on the internet. Oh, when's this tour going on? I want to be a part of it. But lo and behold, it was 5 years previous, and the podcast had well and truly wrapped up by that point in time. But that was a big influence on me, and I've personally had a massive fascination with ancient Greek history, obviously, in particular the Spartans, but the Romans as well were a really big one for me. But after listening to Mike Duncan's retelling of the history, and it was right in that sort of period that I really enjoyed too. I'm not really big on the Byzantine era, but the Republic and I guess the transfer into the Imperial era was a big fascination of my own. And after listening to that, there was really no other option. I had to fall back on, I guess, what was a childhood passion for myself. I had a real I don't know, a love of history from a very, very young age. My mother was a bit of a history buff. She was sort of a bit of a eclectic history pursuer. She had books on, the Minoans. She had books on the Egyptians, on the Mesopotamian peoples as well. She was right into the language, had a real affinity for words, and that really got me started on the path towards history, I suppose. But I didn't have the opportunity to do any sort of study on history, even through high school, where I went to school. Most people were Philistines as far as the history goes. And in order to do ancient history at high school, it would have had to have been via correspondence. And, as a 14, 15, 16-year-old, the idea of, sitting there listening to what would have been the equivalent of a radio show back in those days and sending off papers through the mail just didn't appeal to me. So I ended up pursuing other things. But we got the first computer in about 93, maybe 94, and I had a copy of Windows, and we had a digital copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And that really just, it was basically like having Google search, but for history, and for world affairs and all that. One of the first things I came across there was the history of the Peloponnesian War and the Greco and Persian Wars, and then also the Carthaginian Wars. And those three, I guess, events, if you could call them that, really zeroed me into what my future passions would be. And the Spartans in particular really stood out. And a few years later, I was taking a flight to Melbourne, and I was really nervous of flying. It was my first flight that I'd ever taken in my life. And I was just looking for something to preoccupy myself with while I was on the flights there. And I picked up a book by Paul Cartledge. I'm sure you've come across his works before, on the Spartans.
Yep.
Yeah. Anybody who's done any ancient Greek studies will have Professor Paul Cartledge's work on there. And I picked up one of his books, and all thoughts of fear of flying, of the plane falling out of the sky or something like that, just vanished from my head as I was pouring through the words there. And it really honed me in on, I guess, where I'm at now doing the podcast. But I guess what finally solidified it all was I'd always wanted to travel. We didn't do a lot as a family growing up. We didn't go too far. Like a trip for my family would have been going, half an hour down the road to the beach, which was fantastic. But I had the idea of broader horizons, I suppose. And I was working as a carpet cleaner, of all things, when I was 19, and we were doing some water damage restoration work. And it was a picture shop full of landscape photos and portraits and things like that. And some of the objects were just relatively water damaged, and they were looking to throw them out. And I came across a print by a photographer named George Mayers, I think it is, and he does a lot of landscape portraiture of like the islands like Santorini and Mykonos, the white buildings with the blue windows. And from that moment, I said, right, I know I want to travel, but that is where I am going. So when I was 21, 22, just booked a ticket, return to Istanbul, because it was too expensive to travel to Greece at the time. And from there, that was it. I ended up living up over in Greece and Turkey for about 7 or 8 years, working in tourism and also teaching English in Istanbul to the Turkish people. And really from there, the last 10 or 12 years, it's just been nothing but, probably very similar to yourself, just focusing purely on ancient Greek history and ancient Roman history, and just reading, studying, accumulating bookshelves of books, which are a problem in their own right.
Yes. So what made you I guess, drill with your show, instead of looking at, I guess, Greece as a whole, what made you drill down with just looking at the Spartans on their own terms?
It's a good question. If you knew me personally, you know that I get very fixated on things, and I have a lot of trouble letting things go. So I wanted to tell the story of ancient Greece, definitely. But then when I had a brief synopsis written down about how I would tell that story, the show was thousands of episodes. It'd be in a state of stasis, for lack of a better term. I just would not be able to progress. So I thought probably better just to narrow it down a little bit. And I mean, I'm sure my listeners can appreciate that I go into painstaking detail. So it was really just through convenience. I thought, okay, if I can focus on Sparta, which was, of all the ancient Greek peoples, they were my favorite. I thought maybe I might be able to make some headway there, but 24 episodes in, and I'm still not really out of the 7th century at this stage. So there's a long way to go. So it was more just, for convenience.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I must admit, I did do, when I was sort of penning out what I was going to do with my show, I've gone the other way, where my whole intention was I want to do a show that is just going to be accessible for anyone. So it doesn't matter if you know what you know about Greek history. Hopefully I can, teach you something from what I know. But I still wanted to have enough detail there just to make it interesting for people that had an interest in Greek history. And I think that's when I started off. I'm penning, all right, I'm going to do a show on Athens or a show on Sparta's development and things like that. But as I went along and was drafting, I would start separating episodes into 2 episodes, and then all of a sudden they become 3 episodes. And obviously I'm covering probably in the early stages, doing more of a context of leading up to the classical period. So I'm not focusing on Sparta in the detail that you were, but I did find I was having to create new episodes based off of what I was coming up with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have good intentions, but by the time you start writing, before you know it, like an episode script might be at 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 words, and you've got to make a decision there. Do you trim some things off, or do you just cut it and start with a little mini series, I guess, within the show? But I really enjoy the way that you summarize I'm envious of it, in fact, the way that you can summarize the topics and get it into such a nice condensed and crystallized format. And I listened to all of your episodes, and I've been listening to a couple in the lead up to this discussion, and you really do have an affinity for summary. It's something that I just have no ability to do whatsoever. So it's a real testament to your work there.
Oh, thank you very much.
And I particularly enjoyed your Sparta. This is Sparta episode. That's top notch. Do you find that you use more sources, like historical sources, or do you find you use more secondary sources when it comes to compiling your work?
I tend to, I guess when I'm drafting, I look at more ancient sources first, where I try and, like, for example, I'll look at Herodotus, especially in the early stages, has been a sort of a go-to primary source. And then I'll use, things like Plutarch and Diodorus and things like that to try and piece together, because you do find sort of, I guess, differences with them, but you try and piece together what seems likely. But then I'll also have, in the back of my head, I've read many secondary sources too. So then I'll refer back to those to see how they've pieced the information together. Do I think that's a likely way, or do I think something different? And I guess that's sort of how my drafting sort of progresses.
Who, I guess, if you could pick one, who's your favorite ancient author? Not necessarily Greek, but who do you like reading?
Well, I just have to say Herodotus, because it was the first ancient historian that I read, and I guess he's responsible for basically this rabbit hole I've gone down. So, and it's interesting to read, Diodorus and Plutarch. I guess it's not so much a history, but more of a biography with stories thrown in. Thucydides, which I guess is a bit more, I guess what you'd say, a history, so to speak. But I really find Herodotus very colourful, and I enjoy lots of ambiguity, all the little nuances within there that, it's probably not true, but there's something there that probably is.
the amount of people in the histories that had a premonition or a dream about their impending doom always amazes me when I'm reading Herodotus. It's like, my God, did nobody learn the lessons of the past there? Like if you've had a dream about, for instance, that when the spotted cow turns up, your empire is going to be destroyed or something like that, and you didn't take heed of that dream. It's always amazing that Herodotus, there's always a mystical element into the unfolding of the events in history there, and I love those little tidbits that he gives.
And I find it's not just, I guess, a work of history. You've got, geography, you've got, even philosophy is sort of thrown in there, how he puts conversations in certain people's mouths and things like that, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and I think as far as introductions go, the first few lines of the histories certainly leaves no ambiguity whatsoever as to what this man is going to tell you. That he records these deeds so that these times won't be forgotten by future generations. I'm paraphrasing, but that's roughly what he sets down, and he certainly does that. It's a monumental work.
And he's responsible for where we get the word history from. I mean, you read that first paragraph, and that just sums up what history is supposed to be looking at. So
yeah. You think perhaps that Thucydides was trying to not only outdo Herodotus but also Homer as well in the way that he was constructing his history.
Yeah, it's I guess, as he described, more of like a scientific approach to history. But again, and this is the other thing, I mean, with Herodotus, you have points where he'll give you a couple of stories on certain aspects. You say, I've been told a number of stories. And he'll say, I don't believe this, or I do believe this. And even in the stuff he doesn't believe, he tells you what it is anyway. Whereas I find Thucydides only tells you the stuff he believes. So you don't know what else was around at the time, and obviously you have to question his connection to the period itself. I mean, he was a general during the wars itself. So there's got to be some bias there with how he presents his histories as well.
Yeah, I think that's for sure. I mean, there's definitely instances in Thucydides's War of the Peloponnese that where he says, that this isn't going to occur in his history. Where I'm not going to be like that other historian. He never calls Herodotus out specifically, but I think he was also throwing back to Homer and the Iliad as well, which for all intents and purposes was a history for the classical Greeks, and the way that he joins the Peloponnesian War together to make this 30-year conflict, whereas the Iliad was only a 10-year conflict. So for Thucydides, he was taking on a task that was, in his mind at least, and probably his readership, 3 times greater than Homer. But of course, and you'd understand this as well, that the Peloponnesian War wasn't a contiguous event running from 431 right through to the end of the war. There was breaks in there was bad pieces, there was lulls in the fighting. To call it a continuous war is probably a little bit of a misnomer on Thucydides' part, but you can sort of see what he was just trying to do. He was succinctly aware, I think, of what had come before, and he was looking to set his own work apart.
Yeah, I guess he was trying to take out those sort of mystical elements out of the history. But it is also
scientific,
yeah, and I think it's telling, though, he picks up the history basically where Herodotus left off. Like, he doesn't seem to go back to try and rehash anything. So whether that he's sort of, I guess, implicitly saying that he kind of got the main gist of it, what we believe to be true, but all the other stuff that's sprinkled in there he doesn't agree with. Yeah.
And do you think the reason why it shuts off so quickly and so sharply is that they just simply died?
Yeah, well, I mean, it just seems like the most obvious explanation, I mean, from what I've read. So, I mean, I don't know what else to sort of put in there. But
well, no, it's almost like he's had a heart attack mid-sentence, and that's it. Sort of stops there. And it's funny that Xenophon really picks up right at that moment, and almost in his first line finishes that line that Thucydides was looking to get in there at the history. It's very strange.
Yeah. And this is I guess the great thing for us too, as we travel through these periods, we've almost got this seamless, I guess, flow of primary sources. We've got Herodotus that takes us up to a certain period, and we can almost just seamlessly continue on in that period with Thucydides. Then where he leaves off, we can then continue on with Xenophon. And I guess we get it just gives us good sort of grounding with a primary source as we sort of continue through as well.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think for favourite authors from the ancient period, and look, it's, he casts back anachronistically often, but I absolutely love Plutarch. He was probably one of the first ancient sources that I read, and I love the way that he's more of a, and I've called him this on my show before, he's more of a moralizing biographer rather than a historian. He's very diligent in his source work, and reading through Plutarch, can only make you yearn for I guess probably the burning of the Library of Alexandria never to happen, because he references so many different sources throughout his works there, and you just keep thinking, oh my God, it'd be so great to be able to have some of those sources there. But I really do enjoy his meticulous nature, and I think it was a stroke of genius what he did there to take the Greek world, which had fallen on extremely hard times due to Roman conquest, and living in the shadow of these monuments that were built of far greater times, but then likening those Greek people to the Romans, and to say that that we're not necessarily that different. And I really enjoy the way that he compares the mighty ancient Greeks to the ancient Romans of the time that were mighty, and some of them are just brilliant, absolutely brilliant comparisons. To put Caesar up against, I think, Alexander the Great, that's just a miraculous way to go. Like, you couldn't compare to better people. And some of them are a little bit out of the ways, but I really do enjoy the way that Plutarch writes his. So the Lives for me would be the pick. Have you ever had the opportunity to read Ovid's Metamorphoses?
I've read bits and pieces. I've read through it as I've sort of looked through mythology, and I've just I haven't read it in its entirety, but I've picked out bits and pieces through it.
Yeah, it's a good reference for a lot of the stuff you would have been discussing earlier in your podcast series. But I couldn't recommend that book, and Ovid more generally, to the people listening today. That man was an extremely well-read author, and the way that he manages to pull references from the deep, dark recesses of ancient Greek and ancient Roman history and put it into this narrative of change, I guess, which, as the title suggests, the entirety of the book, the books are all about change through whether it's a spiritual change, a physical change, a metaphysical change. It's a heck of a read, and his prose is just absolutely amazing to read. So for him, he's probably one of my real favorites as well. So I was wondering if you could tell me, like, where are you looking to go with the show from here on in, and what are your plans for the future of the podcast?
So I guess when I first started out, my idea was to begin sort of in the prehistory stage of Greece, and then I guess the vision was to go all right up to the death of Alexander the Great, sort of, I guess, covering what's sort of seen as the end of the classical age. Though, I mean, the more and more I get into this, it's like, do I really want to end there though? So we'll see what happens. I feel like it's going to continue well past that as well. But I mean, I think that's many years down the track too.
Yeah, there's no rush, is there?
No. What about yourself? Was Spartan history going to end at some point, or?
Well, it invariably has to. I mean, the reason I started off in the prehistoric, I guess, phase of Spartan Greek history was, when you say Sparta, the first thing 99% of people think is Thermopylae. It's the Battle of the 300, and that's the sexy topic. But I really wanted to tell the whole story, and then I'm a big fan of dichotomies, and Sparta is just riddled with dichotomies. There's the dual kingship, there's the dual nature of most of their popular gods and goddesses. And then there's finally the Bronze and the Iron Age phase of the Spartan people too. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, or may not be aware that Helen of Troy was first Helen of Sparta, and there was a whole other facet of history that I thought needed to be told there. So I started off with that story and carried it right through to where I am now. But as far as where I want to go, look, I'm looking to flesh out the reformation or revolution, if you like, of Spartan government, politics, and societal practices. And obviously I'll eventually get to the Greco-Persian wars there and the Peloponnesian War. But I think the natural conclusion for my show would be the Battle of Lutra in 371 BCE. I mean, that's, as you know, that's the breaking of the Spartans as a regional power and as a Hellenic power in general. And they'd really become a second-rate state after that, and a more of a fascination. And I think from there on in, you really get confused with the mirage and the fact. And I just don't think I have the heart or the courage to carry on a Spartan narrative from there with any sort of degree of interest for the listeners. So yeah, 371. But at my rate, I go an episode a month and very painstaking through that. May still be a couple of years in the future from here.
And no doubt that wouldn't be the end of your look at Greek history, though, would it? Surely you would be going elsewhere.
Yeah. I've thought of carrying the format over. I mean, what does Athens History Podcast sound like? Or Theban History Podcast or Corinthian History Podcast. From there, I think it's probably worthwhile. At least just putting down a body of work in and around the different polis of ancient Greece. I think Athens is very attractive. It'd be really nice to get into, obviously, the classical playwrights, Aristophanes and Sophocles and well, the names are escaping me right now, but the other guys there. Yep. And also, I guess, the formation of the democracy, which you've covered in pretty good detail as well. There's a lot in there, but, to give a little bit of love to the Thebans and the Corinthians, there's a Macedonians, even the Macedonian line, there's a lot out there that can really be picked apart. So yeah, look, I'll make a decision. I may do like a little poll towards the end and see where people, what most interested, or I'll just go whatever way I think. But yeah, I don't intend to, finishing podcasting from there. It's a great hobby. It'd be hard to give up.
It's too addictive.
It absolutely is. Yeah, is. So
I was just with obviously you're focusing on Sparta. Do you find, I guess, in everyday conversation when you're talking to people in your everyday life and this topic comes up, obviously this is the focus sort of center on the Battle of the 300 and that movie. And how frustrating does that get for you?
Not at all. You're right. I get asked that question a lot. And I mean, if I was to look at it as a purely historical piece of work, it's going to fail every single time. But I mean, Frank Miller's a cartoonist, and I loved his work on Sin City, and I loved his work on the 300 as well. And I think if I was to have a mythological idea of the Battle of 300, there's no better representation. And there's enough little tidbits in there for the historically minded person to go, oh, well, at least he's done a little bit of research. He perhaps knew his Plutarch, and he might have even read Herodotus. But I think if you're going to sensationalize the Greco-Persian Wars, and particularly Thermopylae, then there's no better way to go about it. I was absolutely enthralled by that movie, and I watched it only about 6 months ago, again, for probably the 7th or 8th time. It's, whenever you want to feel uplifted, that's the place to go. And I think, in reality, the depiction of Leonidas or Leonidas is a fair one, on a mythical sort of scale. He had absolutely no intention of returning from that battle, and nor did the other 300 Spartans that were with him. The fact that I think it is Herodotus who notes that all of the Spartan or Spartii homoi equals that went to the war had sons of their own, so they could carry on their line and inherit the plot of land that was every Spartian's right. So I think that depiction of the Spartans being so, all-encompassingly glorifying of battle, I think it's a fair one indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, I did a couple of episodes covering those movies.
Love them.
The second one, I don't know, that was lukewarm one, and that was I must admit that was a tough episode to write, because it was just, I really had to pick and choose what am I going to be talking about here, because there was just so much, so much wrong with it. But anyway,
yeah.
The first one though, I was actually when I sort of came up with the premise of doing that episode, I hadn't watched the movie for quite some time, and so I rewatched it. And I was jotting down notes, and I was thinking, there's actually quite a lot in here that seems to be drawing on what can be found in the sources. And then I started picking each scene apart, and I found, when it comes down to it, a lot of the themes and the metaphors that are tied up in there can actually be found in those ancient Greek sources, whether they're, true or accurate, but they're there. So I found that quite interesting. Even just how scenes are represented. I mean, I I get the same question too. I write about Greek history. Oh, is 300, is that actually real? And and I feel like, well, in some sense it is. I mean, again, I think that the biggest, going into that movie, you need to understand that you're watching a story that's told by a Spartan and he's retelling it to other Spartans. So I guess you need to understand where it's coming from in that respect too. So obviously it's going to be talking them up and demonizing their enemies and those types of things. But I also found it interesting because I guess someone's like, oh, the movie with a charging battle rhinoceros, but then you look at that scene on the second day, and it's, you've got these elephant. Obviously, there were no elephants in this narrow pass, and cavalry charges, and battle rhinos charging into the line. But to me, you've got that part in Herodotus's book where he travels through, kind of like what Homer does with his catalogue of ships, and goes through the Persian army, and talks about these people from this region, how they were armed and what they had. And to me, it seems to be a representation of what's found in Herodotus, where you've got the elephants. So this is the Indian part of the empire. Then you've got the rhino. So you've got like the African part of the empire, and just the different types of troops that are thrown up against the Spartans. There seems to be just calling on all the different areas of the Persian Empire.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good point you make too about how it was in 300. It's a Spartan telling the story to other Spartans. Played by, I think it's David Wenham, isn't it? Our fellow Australian actor there. Yeah, playing the part, and that's a good point. And I think in the minds of the classical Greeks of the time, their idea of what would have occurred at that battlefield probably wouldn't be too far off from Frank Miller's representation. And certainly Herodotus, he doesn't shy away from sensationalism. The amount of, well, he designates rivers and watercourses as either ones that were entirely drank dry by the Persian armies or ones that weren't quite drank dry, and then the ludicrous numbers of the troops and the soldiers and the ships. I think it's 2 million soldiers. I think he puts it down as loosely. Is that about right? Yeah. And I mean, but you're right. The second one, oh, that's a travesty. There's just so much that they got wrong with that movie that it's hard to watch it with any sort of understanding of history and go, I mean, the fact that it's the Spartan navy that turns up at the end there to save the day. And I mean, look, Sparta, it's contentious whether they had a sort of thalassocracy in the 6th century, but certainly by the Greco-Persian Wars, it was Athens that was the predominant thalassocracy in the region by far and away, and Sparta's navy would have, been loosely called a minor flotilla, if that. And the way they completely disjointed the Battle of Salamis, and it really didn't appear to be a major Athenian victory. Moreover, it felt a little bit more like a land battle, like it was very strangely done at the end of the day.
Yeah, just those tangle of ships and just jumping from ship to ship on horseback.
Yeah, and exactly. Yeah, and I don't think they did. Is it Artemisia? That's the
Artemisia?
female?
Yeah.
I don't think they did her a lot of justice either. And I do like Ava Green, but I struggled with that representation.
Yes, to me, it really, I don't know. I think they were really drawing the bow, and you've got the notion of in Herodotus you find this, the women behind the scenes that were sort of in the court manipulating things, and they've sort of taken that to the nth degree and inserted that into Artemisia. But
there's that Greek classical Greek misogyny was always a good one. That the females were always at the root of all evil there, and they were nothing but a corruption on manly virtue and things like that. It was a very convenient excuse to the ancient Greeks, and I guess they probably took a bit of liberty with the movie itself.
Yes, even I don't know. I just didn't get on board with the casting for Themistocles either. It just it didn't seem. I don't know. I always had this vision in my head. If I ever got to do like a mini series on the Greek and Persian Wars, I'd want like a younger sort of Sean Bean playing my Themistocles. It just seems to fit that type of character. A sort of a rough around the edges, cunning sort of character.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that. Yeah, well, I guess in that vein, then and understanding that Leonidas was 60 years of age roughly when he fought at Thermopylae. Who would you think would be better to play him than Gerard Butler? You got an actor in mind for that role?
I haven't really, because I know obviously he was meant to be older, but I found Gerard Butler just seemed to me it worked. It seemed like a good choice.
Worked for me.
Yeah, but
Absolutely.
I don't know. Themistocles, I wasn't on board with it.
Yeah. Now people only listening and not seeing here may miss, but I can see that you're a secret Laconophile in the background there. There's a shield with a Lombarda on it behind you there. Is that correct?
Yeah, just a replica one.
Oh, really? It's not from Plataea?
No, unfortunately not. I think it's a bit not quite big enough either. I think another sort of 10 centimeters on the diameter. It might be a bit more realistic, but no, I just put that up on a of all places, on Facebook, your marketplaces, and someone here in my town was selling it, so I just saw it and I was like,
in Alice Springs.
Yeah, it was. The story, I don't know how true it is, but supposedly they had a family member that worked on the set of 300, and family member had given them the shield, and they ended up with it and were moving and didn't want it anymore, so managed to pick it up for I think $20.
So is that a shield from a prop from the movie?
Supposedly, I don't know how accurate that is. It is quite solid though. It's pretty heavy. So
yeah. That's well, okay. That's got some pretty good provenance to it. Then that gets some respect from me.
And I did look closely when I was watching 300 last, where some of the shields have got seems like the same dings and scratches in the same place that thing has. So
you fancied yourself for picking that shield out of the movie, hey?
Yeah. So I'll just run with that story for now.
Works fine for me. It works fine for me. So I guess we discussed off air that we were going to sort of talk about like a couple of topics today, and I think for yourself we were going to look at, I guess, just a rough overview of the formation of the Athenian democracy, and in all good conscience I couldn't possibly add anything to that discussion. So I guess the first thing I'd really like to know is, can you tease apart the word democracy and how it differed in meaning to the ancient Greeks to what we consider democracy today?
Okay, yeah. So democracy basically comes from two words. So you've got demos, the people, and kratos, so power of the people. And I guess once it was, more developed in Athens, the whole notion of democracy was a direct democracy. So if you were a citizen, again, democracy is only extended to citizens. So we're talking about male Athenians of Athenian birth, and everyone had a say in decisions that were being put forward. So, I mean, if a war was being voted on, if Athens was looking at going to war with someone, and you went to cast your vote, you were basically sending yourself to war, because as a citizen, you would be fighting those wars yourself. Whereas now, we've outsourced, I guess, a lot of that people power to representatives that take it to Parliament, especially here in Australia anyway.
Yeah, okay. Now, just quickly, my numbers might be a little bit off, but I've read of various figures of male citizenry within Athens and Attica more generally. Was the number around about 200,000, 250,000 during the 5th century?
Yeah, I think you had quite a large number, but the actual people that could actually meet would have been far, far less.
Yeah.
And
so what do they need? What do they need for a quorum or to be able to pass a legislation? Was there a certain figure they needed to vote?
Well, now you're testing me, getting further on into the because I haven't really covered too much of I guess the later developments of democracy, but I'm going to have to pass at the moment.
No, it's fine. I was curious because I wonder that it's such a. I mean, I've been to Athens and I've travelled Attica fairly extensively, and I guess the region that would encompass the voting population is quite extensive. Like, and I give Athens a lot of grief in my show for its fickle government. I can't and how capricious it was. I can't imagine them calling an assembly and then waiting for the obligatory 7 or 8 days for the entire male population of the region to assemble. So I'm assuming that the people in Athens itself had a lot more power as far as governance goes than, say, somebody from one of the outlying demes.
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, they're quite fickle. It seems to be, I don't know, I think Athens, ever since sort of the inception of democracy came about, you have this fighting between the people and, the eupatridae, the nobles. Even as democracy developed, it just seems to be this hangover of this power struggle that began in the archaic period that then led on into the classical period as well. Which doesn't ever seem... Sorry? The Eupatridae.
The Eupatridae, were they... Is it the Council of the Areopagus?
So you've got... So the Eupatridae were like the nobles, like the well-born within Athens.
Right.
And then... And they were the ones who had held power in the beginning. So you had, I think, you had your archons. And the archons were always chosen from the Eupatridae class in Athens. And then you had the Areopagus. So this was the council where all archons, people who had served as archons would then serve in the Areopagus. And you could almost argue that perhaps the Areopagus had more power than the archons actually did, because they, if you didn't sort of, as an archon, didn't sort of go the way they wanted you to, you could risk losing your admission to the Areopagus later on.
Right. So it looks like a sort of an oligarchic structure above.
Yeah, so you had basically the few at the top that were governing things, and their interests were the only ones that were being met. And they would, obviously, change would be very, very, very slow if it ever did happen. And you still had an assembly, which it's thought that this was maybe a hangover from the Bronze Age, but more of an assembly where a king would come and announce what was happening. It was like a gathering of people, but it seems to still be in place, but serve no real function at that time.
Yeah. So where do you see the genesis of democracy? Like, where does it sort of start, or who does it start to formulate with? Is it Solon, or does the quasi-mythical or mythical Theseus, does he have some attribution towards it? Where do you see it beginning?
Well, obviously, yeah, they talk about Theseus and creating a commonwealth of cities in Attica to create the first democracy. But I mean, obviously, we see that there was an oligarchy in place as the archaic period was coming about, and I think it probably has something to do with. I think this is a similar concept to Sparta, but you've got coming out of the Dark Ages into the archaic period, you've got an explosion of people, of a population that seems to increase dramatically. And it just seems to, when you've got the few at the top that are ruling, and then you've got an ever increasing size of people within that society, you're going to start to have issues around governing, because with more people, you're going to need to put more governances in place to be able to control populations and do whatever else. And I think this is where the discontent between rich and poor starts coming about. And we find, especially in Athens, you got a lot of people paying debts, like so farmers and whatever else, to the rich, and they'll be selling themselves into slavery. And what you'd end up finding is more and more land would start be accumulating by the rich, because the poor can't keep hold of it or pay their debts, and they'd end up basically slaves on their former lands that are now owned by the Eupatridae.
Yeah.
But where it started, I mean, because this is the interesting thing too, where you get, obviously, the whole notion of tyrants seem to be born out of this power struggle between rich and poor as well. So a tyrant obviously more than often would have the support of the people and the populations, and they would have the backing and would try and take power. And obviously, back in these times, tyrant doesn't mean what it means to us today.
Yeah.
It was someone who gained power by irregular means. And a tyrant could be, quite a good leader. It just depended on their character too. But so I think the first time they talk about Athens getting a potential tyrant was they talk about Cylon, and though I'm not so sure, because, and there's two reasons here. He made a bid trying to capture the Acropolis. Now, all of the backing he had came from his father-in-law, who was Tyrant of Megara. So was there something going on there between them? And what then I think questions whether he was installing a tyranny was he didn't seem to have the population on his side, because the general population came out and besieged him. So his bid on power failed because he just didn't have the popular support there.
Yeah.
But and then we then
sorry to interrupt just quickly. Yeah. Is that where the enmity between Megara and Athens began during that period?
Yeah, because after that, I know when Cylon was besieged, and so were his supporters, and a large chunk of them had come from Megara as well. And after Cylon supposedly escaped, but many of his supporters were executed by the Athenians. And
that's fascinating. Yeah, fascinating, because one of the possible precursors to the Peloponnesian War was the Athenian embargo on trade with Megara, which was a Spartan ally at the time, which which more or less forced the Spartans' hand in towards one of the many, I guess, flashpoints that were occurring in that period. It's fascinating. And
we find, even with many of these influential leaders, they seem to have gained their popularity from conflicts with Megara. So it's and it was to do with trade as well, where Athens was being starved for their trade networks. But so you had Cylon, and then the next sort of major figure that comes along is Draco. So I guess most people have heard of Draco as the lawmaker, and his draconian laws, because everything was punishable by death.
Why was that, Mark?
Sorry?
Why was that?
Well, because supposedly even for minor infringements, he saw death as being the only punishment, and so for more serious ones, he couldn't come up with anything worse than death.
I love that story.
But the other interesting thing is, he seems to be credited with giving a fighting class more political power as well. So, and this sort of ties in with perhaps the rise of hoplite warfare and phalanxes, and where now more people were seeking political power, because they were the ones that were in the field. They were fighting for that city-state. And I don't know, I feel like this is a very similar theme with Sparta and their realization of needing their standing army, and the hoplite force developing, where certain reforms, and I think this is political reforms seem to really sort of tie in with this thought of the hoplite warfare as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Actually, I've just quickly, there's an author, Robin Lane Fox, who basically puts the rise of democracy down to the phalanx, calling the phalanx a democratic mode of warfare, whereby the massed ranks of cavalry charge, which would have been the traditional purview of the nobles who could afford horses, were basically ineffective from that point on. So the nobles really had to relinquish some of their power to the people who could form up in these serried ranks of spears and mow them off the battlefield.
Yeah, absolutely. And then later on, you find the same thing with the rowers in Athens. Obviously, these people that are from the lower, very low classes now have so much. Athens relies so much on their contribution to the defense of Athens now. So political power needs to be extended to them more so as well.
Right. Okay.
But obviously, a lot of people do highlight Solon as being the father of democracy.
So was Solon after or before Draco?
So he came afterwards.
Right.
Supposedly a lot of the reforms of law reforms and potentially whatever political reforms he may have had came about, but it doesn't seem to have stopped the faction or the class fighting in Athens by that stage.
Right. Do you put him as a purely historical figure, or do you think there's some sort of, like Lycurgus, who we'll be speaking about soon, do you think he's more mythical?
I feel like he is a historical figure just because of the background he's given, where he's shown as he was given command of Athenian forces against Megara, and this is where he's earned his fame and his respect in Athens, and this was what led him to be chosen as the archon or extraordinary archon that was taken more power to enact these reforms as well. Though everything that's ascribed to him, I don't know, can we ascribe all of what's been written about that? Yes, that's I think more the question is, what can we actually attribute to him, and what's maybe came before or after him. So
understood.
But I know he's definitely some of the biggest things he was known for was the shaking off of burdens. So it was so Athenian citizens couldn't put themselves up for security anymore, so they couldn't be sold into slavery, and a lot of cancelling of debts as well. So now supposedly there's hints that he may have tipped off some of his noble friends. He was supposedly from the Eupatridae as well, so but he was not meant to be mega rich. He was, I guess, more at the lower end, but he's supposed to have tipped off some of his friends, who then bought up a bunch of land knowing that they were going to lose those debts. But he's got other things so there was a lot of issues with trade, because Athens was not a very good place to be growing wheat and those types of things, but it was, for a farmer, they were the types of things they wanted to grow them because they could export them. But then it left very little to feed the Athenians themselves. And he tried to stimulate the economy by making olive groves, basically the crop of choice. And then he also had fathers were required to now teach their sons a trade, so that they would then grow up and most likely they would take on what their father's occupation was. So you had a continual cycle. You didn't have any sort of areas that would be lacking in manpower. And he's supposed to have, because it seemed Draco may have had something to do with this, giving hoplites more power. And it's thought, did he come up with some sort of council of 400? And then Solon's now also been considered with this, the Bulle, the Council of 400, which and the idea was they would have come up with all the agendas that would be put forward to be voted on, and they would come from all the different tribes. So you had 4 different tribes in Athens by this stage, and he's supposed to have got rid of most of Draco's law code except for murder. So the murder punishment stayed in place. And he also created a new sort of rank structure in society. So it was based off of wealth. So you had 4 different rank structures, and the top 3 had involvement in more of the political life, whereas the lower end feats, they could still attend the assembly but couldn't be voted into political positions. But now you had not just the Eupatridae that could hold offices. You had like hoplite class, they called them the yoke men, but they were wealthy enough to afford the armor that a hoplite would need in warfare. Right. Now the problem is that in the end, a lot of these reforms wouldn't work, or they wouldn't take hold, and especially like the farming of olive groves. I mean, it takes how many years for an olive tree to mature, and so there wasn't really the incentive to take those up. And he's also then, after these reforms are in place, he's supposed to have left on a 10-year travel around the Mediterranean, kind of like someone else we know. But and this seems to be a common thing with, I guess, these leaders that are ascribed with so many wise leaders that are ascribed with so many reforms and whatever else. Yeah. But supposedly this was in place because a lot of his reforms didn't specifically state, if this happens, do this. It was more of a guideline, and it was basically left to the people to fit those guidelines to what was taking place at the time. And we are told at the end of the day that both rich and poor were not satisfied with what he had put in place. He seems to have tried to appease both sides equally, but made no one happy.
A very Athenian.
Yes. But yeah, so I mean, some people sort of put the Solon sort of the father of democracy. And he seems to have put some of these ideas in place, but they haven't taken hold. But the idea is still there, and because then they do become further developed. Obviously, it goes back through. There's more class warfare that takes place, and this is funny. This reminds me of a meme I saw a couple of weeks ago with that the Evergreen ship in the Suez Canal.
Yes.
And it was blocking the. It basically had the first picture was of a cruise ship heading through the Corinthian Isthmus, the canal that's cut through there, nice and neat and straight line, and it's Athenians inventing democracy, and then the next picture is the Evergreen, sideways in the Suez Canal, and this is the Athenians implementing democracy.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, I don't think the invention of democracy was such a straight line, though. There's so many, there seems to be periods of, it's not clear if civil war broke out, but there's hints that it may have in between these periods as well. So there seems to be a lot of fighting between the classes, even amongst these reforms, and how democracy has been constructed.
Interesting. And so after Solon, was it Pisistratus?
Yeah, so we had Pisistratus who came next, and this would be Athens' first tyrant. So
right,
things were pretty bad, and you had, I guess, they talk about three factions that have formed in Athens. You had the men at the plains, the coast, and beyond the hills, and he seems to be more popular with the people. So the others, like the plains and the coast, they were looking more for the eupatridae and different forms of government, whether it oligarchy and whatever else. And so Pisistratus became, I guess, a champion of the people, and there was faction fighting between these three factions, basically. And while the other two were sort of fighting amongst each other, Pisistratus tried to, he rode into Athens, had someone or beaten himself up, and basically accused that the other two, his opponents in the other two factions, had tried to kill him, and he was end up being assigned an armed guard, and then
Oops.
Sorry.
Oops.
Yeah, and so he then tried to seize power from Athens, and this would be his first attempt on tyranny. But in the end, he would be his opponents would come together and oust him. So his tyranny didn't take hold at that stage. And then obviously all the faction fighting continued on, and then one of his opponents from one of the other parties formed an alliance with him, and they then tried to take power, and they tried to invoke the divine to do this one. And Herodotus calls this what does he say, the silliest trick in the book.
Is this the story of the mock Athena?
Yeah, so they find a really tall, beautiful woman out in the countryside, and they pass the word that Pisistratus has been returned to Athens by Athena, and they ride through on a chariot with this tall woman dressed up as Athena, and he takes power. Now the obviously had the backing of one of the other parties, and to cement this alliance, he had agreed to marry. I'm trying to remember his name. I think it was Megacles, was the leader of the other party, and he agreed to marry his daughter to sort of cement this this alliance. And it seems to have, while that alliance was in place, it was all fine, but it worked out that he refused to, this daughter would just be a sort of a secondary wife that he had off to the side, and he didn't agree to have any children with her, which this then greatly offended Megacles. And once again, he's taken from power. And he ends up leaving Athens and spends some time out. I can't remember exactly where he went, but he ended up getting some supporters, and he was able to come back. And this is where he lands at the Bay of Marathon on his return with his supporters. And supposedly a battle's fought outside of Athens itself, and the Athenian troops are supposedly surprised and run back into the city. And he wields in with his forces, and then he uses another trick to disarm everyone, where he tries to address the crowd, but no one can really hear him. So he says, "Everyone come up onto the Acropolis, where he can address everyone properly." And now you can't take your weapons up there, so everyone had to leave them at the gates. And then all his supporters gathered all the weapons and basically disarmed all the opposition. And so his third attempt was successful, and he became Tyrant of Athens. So Athens' first tyrant was Pisistratus. And we are told that he was quite a benevolent ruler, and was actually quite good for Athens, and especially for the people themselves. But the thing you find, I guess, with tyrannies is you may have a good ruler, but they then pass the power onto their sons. And that's exactly what happened with Pisistratus. Once he died, he had two sons, Hippias and Hipparchus. And Hippias, being the oldest, took on the tyranny. And we're told again it was all fairly good to live under their rule, but until an act of jealousy, where basically through some jealousy through a male lover, and what it culminated in was an assassination attempt at a festival, and his brother Hipparchus would be assassinated, and the attempt was done on Hippias as well, but he escaped. But from that point on, he basically became very, very wary of everyone, and just very suspicious of anyone around him by that stage. And we're told that, I guess, our sense of the word of tyrant then sort of comes into being here, where he acted like a tyrant as we would understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it was another, supposedly, I'm trying to think, maybe 10 or so years he ruled in this way. And it ended up being the Alcmeonidae, who were one of the big Eupatridide families in Athens. Now, they had been previously exiled from Athens because of when Chilon's attempt took place. They were the ones responsible for, they killed a bunch of supporters that were supposedly protected by a sanctuary, and this was seen as a great pollution. So while they were in exile, they then turned to some of your friends, the Spartans, to try and oust Hippias from his rule in Athens.
Most embarrassing for the Spartans too, because up until that point they were quite supportive of the tyranny of the Pisistratidae. So
yeah, and I think and understanding the Spartans too, they were very, very pious people, and the Achaemenides used the Delphic oracle to be able to impart on some, I guess, some suggestions of what they should be doing.
Yeah. I think they received a commission, right, to rebuild the Temple of Delphi. Yeah. And naturally, they were in a pretty good spot to influence what the Pythia was saying. And the story goes that the Spartans were, I guess, making personal and political pilgrimages to Delphi, as they often did on a regular basis, to receive the oracle. And the oracle, regardless of the request, would always say that the god Apollo will not be happy until freedom is restored to the people of Athens, or something like words to that effect. But the interesting tidbit about that is that, yes, indeed, the Spartans were incredibly pious, and that was a well-known fact outside of Sparta as well. But the king in question at the time, Cleomenes, he wasn't really a pious man, in that in the year 491 BCE, slightly after where we're talking about right now, he in turn bribed the Delphic oracle to get his co-king Demaratus removed from power. So I guess, on one hand, they were a pious people. I think on the other, Cleomenes was more of a pragmatic man when it came to the power of Apollo and his oracle there. And it's been proposed that perhaps because Hippias was potentially a Medizer and a friend of the Persians, and Cleomenes by this stage was thoroughly anti-Persian, that might have had a little bit more to do with his reasoning behind going after Athens and removing Hippias from the tyranny there. Yeah. And Herodotus, I think it's book 5. He says something, he quotes exactly what you're saying there, that it was the Alcmanid family that bribed the oracle to tell the Spartans that, regardless of what they heard, that they were to get rid of Hippias. But if you look into the detail there, it was probably more to do with anti-Persian sentiment.
Yeah, and when you look at Spartan history, that seems to come up with a lot with other cities as well, with conflicts with Athens and Megina and whatever else.
Oh, yeah.
But obviously the Spartans would be instrumental in ousting Hippias from Athens, and
we're happy to help.
Yeah. But then out of that, I mean, it didn't solve any issues either. But out of that, you had two other political rivals that developed in Athens. So this is where you had Cleisthenes and Asagoras. And Asagoras, he sought the Spartans as supporters to install him in Athens as well. So it was interesting that they had ousted a tyranny. I mean, obviously we're saying it's probably other political motives in the background, but they've ousted a tyranny, but now they're going to support another tyranny to be installed in Athens. Now, obviously, Cleisthenes seems to have had a lot more influence with the people, because when the Spartans came in that second time, from memory, it was only a small force that they came in with, but the people came out and besieged them on the Acropolis.
Yeah.
And basically they ended up surrendering and left Athens. And then so Cleisthenes at this stage had actually left Athens for his own safety. And so he wasn't leading this siege, so to speak. But once everyone was kicked back out, he was recalled and installed, because he had given promises that he would give the people much more power. And this is now where the assembly becomes much more important in Athens. And I think the Council of 400 is now increased to the Council of 500. And we get... because we had there was the big problem, obviously, with the factions that were the political factions that were forming around Athens, and he created this more complex system that would see. Now, me trying to explain the system off the cuff is going to be impossible, but
that's okay.
This is where we now have the 10 tribes come into effect. In Athens, and you basically have the demes that are broken up, which are like local governments within areas. And then everything's broken into geographical areas as well. So you would have a tribe, but within that tribe, you would have people that would end up being from all different geographical areas around Attica. So it would be much harder for a political faction to form within the tribe based on their geographical locations, because you're going to have different wants and needs from different people, depending if they live, in the hills, or if they live near Athens, or if they live on the coastline. So this saw a way of trying to avoid those, sort of factions forming and this sort of faction warfare taking place.
Yeah, my understanding is it was more of a breaking down, I guess, of familial and I guess clan relationships, and making it more about a tribe or a greater selection of area to sort of give people a little bit more connection to other facets of the population, right? And that sort of that really helps spur on the democracy from there. Yeah,
and that's one of the other reforms he put in place, was instead of someone being known by such and such of their father's name, it was now more where they were from.
Yeah.
And so he was trying to basically break that line of noble birth. I mean, but you read ancient history, and it doesn't get away from it, does it?
Never.
People
Absolutely.
Describe through their birth line. So, but he tried to attempt that, and he also the whole concept of the olive groves that Solon put in place, where olives would become Athens' main export, that finally took hold because he was able to give farmers small loans. So while they were waiting years and years for their crops to mature, they were basically not in debt when they were doing it. And so the idea was basically Athens was a perfect place to grow olives. And so olives and olive oil became one of the top exports, which they could export out. And in this way, they could then purchase the grain they needed and bring that into Athens, because that was just not something they couldn't grow in abundance to support their population. And,
very interesting.
And with that, the pottery market took off as well, because you had to store.
Yeah, the attic ware. So yeah, okay, yeah. But in all the museums that you see.
Yes. So I mean, that roughly takes us up to where the sort of the Greco-Persian Wars start developing. And so you're looking at a much more democratic sort of Athens by this stage. And then that's where people have then also labelled Cleisthenes as the father of democracy as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, well, I haven't really researched it as heavily as I perhaps should. That's an interesting synopsis. No, thanks for bringing it up to date, because I wasn't sure if it was Solon. I'd heard Chiron before. Yeah, Draco, obviously, his law code, and yeah, I think Cleisthenes, as you say, he was the one that really put the finishing touches on the democracy.
Well, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of our conversation. As you could see, this was quite a different approach than the rest of the series. I would love to hear your thoughts on this format, as I would like to engage with other podcasters and authors in conversation, releasing these episodes in amongst the narrative series as it progresses. Anyway, let me know what you think, and if this is something that you would enjoy hearing along with the main series. For part 2 of our collaboration, head over to www.spartanhistorypodcast.com, or on your favourite podcasting platform and search for Spartan History Podcast. And make sure to follow Steve over on Facebook at Spartan History Podcast and on Twitter at Spartan_history. Lastly, for those of you on Patreon or those wishing to begin supporting the series, the entire conversation can be found there in the feed, along with the video version of the entire conversation. Thank you everyone for the support, and I look forward to seeing you when we continue our narrative in the series with episode 31, Victory in Greece.